Hi guys, I'm Kristen. Welcome and welcome back. Today I'm going to be sharing my April wrap-up, so all of the books that I managed to read in the month of April. Some quick stats to start off with. I finished 8 books in the month of April, 2 new releases, 2 new to me authors, 1 series start, 2 sequels. The rest were standalones with the asterisk that I didn't count the fact that a contemporary romance is part of a series, and I just called them all standalones. Let me know, do you record that, like companion books within like the same world in a romance series? Do you count them as series? I kind of don't want to, and I didn't this month. 4 of the books that I read were intentional reads, like priority reads. 3 of them were actual priority reads from my list of 24 books in 2024. And then 1 was a book that I mentioned in a video that I want to read. And from there, let's jump into the books. I do have a few contemporary romance books as well as some fantasy and sci-fi. So I'm going to do the contemporary romance first. If you just want to hear about the if you just want to hear about the fantasy and sci-fi books that I read, skip ahead to the end of the video. I will put timestamps down below. So first off was Just for the Summer by Abby Jimenez. This is one of my priority reads for the year. It was a priority new release, and I absolutely loved this book. It was a huge return to love for the part of your world series. Again, I counted it as a standalone, but this is the part of your world series, which I loved. The second book, Yours Truly, didn't quite work for me as much, and this one was absolutely a 5-star read. I thoroughly loved it. It had huge emotional impact and totally worked for me. So this is a really funny setup. We are following 2 characters. It's a dual POV, and they're both people who have that once I break up with somebody, that person then finds their the person they're supposed to marry or the person they're going to be with curse. I was curious to see how she was going to make this work, in a sense of what are the odds of 2 people who have this curse meeting, and the way that Abby Jimenez solved this was absolutely genius. They meet on Reddit, and then another thing is the fact that they don't happen to live in the same state, and you're like, well, it'd be crazy to move states just to meet to break this pretend curse that they both have. And so she made one of the main characters a travel nurse, so all she has to do is take her next assignment in the city where the other guy lived. So it was absolutely perfect. Kudos to Abby Jimenez for working through a way that made sense, that wasn't the most unrealistic thing ever. Loved it. And so of course the 2 decide or agree to date in order to break the curse for each other. The dialogue and the banter between the main characters was so good. It honestly felt like they had so much chemistry, and they were practically best friends before they even physically met. So the buy-in here for me was really huge. Emotionally, the emotional, mental stuff that they're going through, I thought was very well done. We're dealing with complicated mother relationships. Both characters, one is a little bit more intense than the other one, but they both really impacted the situation of what was happening and the will they, won't they, is this real, is it just for the summer, casual, etc. So I think that she did a really good job of all of that. It is related to the part of your world scenario. I wasn't aware that it was part of the part of your world world. Oh my god, I hate that I have to say that dual time. What are the odds? So I wasn't aware that was happening, or that was part of this book. But then it did, and it was a pleasant surprise, and then it did it in a different way that totally blew my mind. If you know, wow, wasn't that the craziest reveal ever? If you were to pick them up and read them really quickly together, you will probably catch on a little bit sooner than I did. But it was so good. I also, kudos to Abby Jimenez also for taking the route that she did in terms of the ending, and with our main characters dealing with the stuff that's going on in their life. I thought that was a really bold choice, but also an extremely realistic choice, and I was really happy that is the route that went. I'll leave it there. I also read Funny Story by Emily Henry. I did do a full review, so I will link that up in the cards if you would like to check that out. This is a setup here where we have somebody who is left by her fiance for that guy's female best friend. And because our main character moved to the city with him, and he kicks her out of his house, of course, she doesn't own it, she then has nowhere to live, so she moves in with the female best friend's ex-boyfriend. So the 2 people who were left are now living together, and it's a roommates fake dating situation to make the other couple jealous. Overall, while I did really enjoy this book, it was not my favorite Emily Henry ever, but it also wasn't my least favorite Emily Henry. I felt like it wasn't quite as emotionally heavy-hitting from what I have come to expect for Emily Henry, but to be fair, these were not like emotional stuff that really, really connected with me personally, and I do think that to some extent you have to like really feel a little bit more, like you have to care to some extent, like quite a bit about the mental emotional part of what the main character is going through in order for Emily Henry's books to really work for you, or for it to be like an amazing Emily Henry experience. And I think that's why generally a lot of people have very different views about each of Emily Henry's various books. Overall, I liked it. True to form, I really enjoy the way Emily Henry writes romance books. I like her writing, I like her dialogue, I like the banter that she creates characters. I think she does a really great job of creating sexual tension, and I enjoy reading. I don't find her intimacy scenes cringy at all. I think they're a very pleasant reading experience. So overall, it was a solid read. I did really enjoy it. It just wasn't a new favorite. And again, you can check out my full thoughts if you want to see them there. I also read Secretly Yours by Tessa Bailey. Tessa Bailey is a romance author that does usually work for me. I do remember when this one came out and I wasn't really interested in the concept. The reason why I picked it up when I did is because it was available now at the library and I needed something to read that was not the book, the fantasy book that I ended up finishing in May that I needed a break from. That was Jade Legacy. So I read Secretly Yours. The setup here is that our main character is a, chaos girly, never on time. Everything is, a little bit wild and unplanned. And her high school crush moves back to town for the summer to take some sabbatical while he writes his book. And she gets drunk and leaves him a secret admirer message, which is why I didn't read this book in the first part. I thought that was really, really cringy. Fortunately, it didn't play a huge role in like the day-to-day of them interacting. Like it wasn't exclusively through these letters, so that was really nice. And it's more that she does some gardening work and he's very intrigued by her. Let's say he's a total opposite, straight-laced, everything on time, like setting timers on how long he's going to spend doing certain things. Very, very structured person, and it's a very opposites attract kind of a setup that they're pretty open in terms of discussing as part of the fact that they're very obviously into each other, but very, very, very different. Overall, it was fine. I just didn't really care. Overall, though, I do really like the way that our author handled like the third act breakup, the conflict kind of thing. It wasn't a situation where somebody is like obviously in the wrong, and it actually felt like both characters were more like, felt like they had messed things up. And I actually thought that was like a really positive way to do the third act conflict, where no one felt like it was to blame and they were both like upset about what they had done and not like angry and upset about the other person. And I thought that was really great. And this is actually a trend that she continued on into the next book that I read, which was Yours, Unfortunately Yours, which is a book that I have previously DNF'd. However, seeing these two side characters in Secretly Yours to then have their own book made me care a little bit more about the characters, so I ended up picking it up next. And in Unfortunately Yours, it is a marriage of convenience where our main character, our female lead, is the sister of the brother from the first book, and she comes back home after kind of crashing and failing, makes a huge mistake at work and gets fired. So she wants her trust fund in order to open up her own hedge fund. However, she has this really antiquated trust fund that requires her to be married and employed in order to have access to that money. So she convinces this guy that she met in the first book, who is an ex-Navy SEAL, who is starting a winery it's too much time to explain. She meets this guy in the first book. They kind of really, really instantly hit it off and then have a big blowout. And they're enemies, or they hate each other. And so this is a pretend, or at least the setup here was supposed to be hate to love, marriage of convenience. But I think describing it as hate to love is putting you up with like false expectations. Go into this thinking marriage of convenience, and then you won't be disappointed, which is what happened with me when I previously DNF'd this, is that like, it's clear that they don't hate each other. They're actually very, very into each other, and that's very obvious from moment number one of reading this book and their internal dialogue. It also even feels like they're like ribbing and saying mean things to each other is performative, because they're like playing up on this internalized belief that they hate the other person, and it just feels, like I said, like performative. But overall, I actually enjoyed this book. I enjoyed our main characters, and I although I was really, really frustrated about some of the things that were done, I understand why they were done for like a mental, emotional reason. And it didn't go the way that I thought it was going to go. But my biggest pet peeve with this book is that the timeline is outrageous. It's outrageous. It's so beyond a realistic timeline that it just fuels my rage for all of that. Anyway, overall, I enjoyed these two books. I think I liked Secretly Yours a little bit. Not Secretly Yours. I liked Unfortunately Yours a little bit better, but overall they're just kind of fine in the grand scheme of things. I got a recommendation for Written in the Stars as a really great sapphic romance because I mentioned in the past that I had been struggling to find great contemporary romance books that were sapphic that worked for me. And this was a great recommendation. I did really, really enjoy it. Let me think if I can remember the setup here. It's like the one girl is an astrologist who works for an app. She gets set up with the creator of the app's sister on a date. It's a horrible blind date. They do not hit it off. It's very like opposites attract kind of thing where like one is, not into astrology at all and thinks it's hogwash and is kind of having a bad day. And anyway, it doesn't go well. It's a bad first date. But our main character, who is the brother of the app creator, she like cannot be set up on any more dates by her brother, and so she tells him that it went well. And then she has to convince the other girl to pretend that they're dating, and of course it's fake dating then, so that her brother will like lay off and stop setting her up with people. They are attracted to each other right from the beginning, but they just have like a bad first date, and they have a couple like kind of tough interactions, like a little bit of like not quite seeing eye to eye or not quite like coming across very well with all of this confusion about why they have to do the fake dating thing. But once the two start to be less, like once that animosity kind of softens, it is clear that they like have really great chemistry. They had really great communication. Overall, I thought it was a really great book. It wasn't like so memorable in the grand scheme of things. I'm actually like struggling to come up with things to say about it right now. So I guess that like plays into it, but it did really work well for me in the moment. I really enjoyed it. One of my DNFs for the month was that I picked up the next book, which was the brothers' love story, and it just like so boring. And I did not care at all. And those are all of the contemporary romance books that I read. Out of, in the grand scheme of things, 2 of those 5 romance books were actually priority reads. It's just like, what are the odds that also happened at the same time? I randomly picked up 3 other contemporary romances. Okay, now for all of the fantasy and sci-fi books that I read this month, of which there were only 3. I was working on Jade Legacy for quite a bit of this month, but as I said, I had to take an emotional break from it, and I wound up finishing that in May. So I'll start with the sci-fi here, and this was Second Rebel, or The Second Rebel? Yeah, The Second Rebel by Lyndon Lewis. This is the second book in the First Sister series. This was one of my priority reads for the year. It was a priority series continuation. So check on another priority. I did forget to mention that Funny Story was also a priority new release. So that makes the 3 priority books that I read for this month. So in the first book in this series, The First Sister, we're following 3 different characters. And this is a world where, it's our world actually, it's even set in our solar system. I got a popsicle. And in here we have sort of like Earth and Mars settlers versus, no wait, yeah, Mercury and Venus. I think that's the divide, if I'm remembering. The 2 sides are still at odds, and there's like a little bit of a war still going on, but it's not too intense. And we're following 3 different characters who are on sort of separate sides. So on one side, we're following First Sister, and she is a religious representative on a spaceship. She doesn't really have a name. She goes by the First Sister, like her title, and she is asked to start reporting on the new captain that is taking over this ship. And then we're also following Leto on the other side of this divide. And Leto is like a trained military personnel. He's, I think he was referred to as a duelist, or he was the rapier. I don't remember the specific title. It's like a 2-person combo thing. And he gets called up to do this mission. His old partner has gone AWOL. And he is sent off to find that person, dead or alive, essentially. And then we get the partner, Hero, who is telling their side of the events in the form of recordings that they have sent to Hero. So we're hearing as we go through the book, that Hero has sent to Leto. Now in the Second Rebel, I obviously can't say too much about the plot as it's the second book in a series, but overall this series I find is like really, really attainable. It deals a lot with consent and body autonomy. This one I felt like had a lot to do with what one is willing to do or what it is okay to do in order to fight for the cause, sort of. It definitely had elements of that. I think First Sister is one of the most interesting characters I've ever read from. And the audiobook, I did listen to the audio again. The audio is so intense, and the narrator who does First Sister's voice just like makes First Sister so interesting. There's a whole component with this like side character in her storyline that I find so intriguing. I never know what First Sister is going to do. She's a little bit of a wild card. Like, she's a bit of a loose cannon in like such a good way. So I really enjoy her side of things, even though again I wasn't sure how it was going to tie in to the storyline. It was definitely like a second book where things have come together and now things are apart, and you're like unsure of how things are going to tie in again once more. The additional POV I could have left. There was a relationship component to that I thought was, the timing just wasn't its best. It got really, the arc in which that relationship goes on in this story had a timeline that didn't work for me. Generally, I find that this series gives me really intense emotional hits that just really hit, and endings that blow my mind, that make me really excited to pick up the next book whenever I do. I forget what the name of the last book is. I'm going to pop it up, so I'm definitely going to be reading that book before the end of this year. There, I've said it. I have to follow through now. I have to finish this series before the end of the year because it's so good, and I have thoroughly enjoying this. Definitely sci-fi that I think is relatable, and that you don't have to be too into like the science or the technology in order to have it be successful for you. I also read Age of War. I believe this is the third book, if I'm remembering correctly. This is by Michael J. Sullivan, the Legends of the First Empire series that I have been reading and absolutely adoring. I'm currently reading the fourth book, like as of time of filming. It's just like the most consumable audiobook and by far like the most readable 6-book series I've ever picked up. Like it just, you just fly through it. I can't say too much about this series overall. Like, it is a classic fantasy setup where we're having like humans rise up sort of against their elven overlords. It is really who they thought to be were gods until one of the humans accidentally kind of kills an elf. And then they realize, hey, are they gods? I do feel like each particular book has like, it's not contained, but it has like a very set, like, this is what we're focusing on. And this one, obviously, Age of War, things have started to escalate. Age of War continued to add in some POVs. It never feels like too much. The way that he gives you insight into who these people are fundamentally, like how they think about themselves, how they slot themselves into the world, their cares and woes and triumphs and failures, is just like, he does it so subtly and seemingly with such few words, but so impactfully. There are moments, like character moments in these books that just absolutely devastate me. So there's something about the way that, like, the simplicity of the way he builds you, that he builds these characters around you, so that then when things happen, or like these small subtle lines just tear you apart. I think Mondule in this book is one of the Frey, and he's like the prince of the leader of the Frey, and he is so unintentionally funny, the way that he thinks internally. He's just hilarious to read from, but he's like so delusional, right? I did do a full review, so I will link it in the cards as well, for the first book in the series, and I'm definitely, when I'm done, I'm going to do a should you read this series, because yes, you should. I think the last book that I finished this month, and the last fantasy here, is a young adult fantasy that I read, and that is Once Upon a Broken Heart by Stephanie Garber, I don't remember, I'm sorry. And this is a young adult fantasy that I had heard a lot about. A lot of people talk about it. I generally had felt that what I had heard was that it was a little bit on the nose. It was like very aware of itself as a YA, and that generally it was like a delightfully good time. And that is why I chose to pick this YA fantasy up. I don't tend to read a lot of young adult fantasy anymore. I just did last week a video recommending YA fantasy for adult fantasy readers, and this was an example of one of the ones that I wanted to read personally. Unfortunately, it didn't really live up to that like delightful, good time, self-aware YA that I had been expecting. It was also the only series that I started this month, and it's going to be a series that I'm going to be DNFing. I don't really feel the need to continue on. I actually had nothing else to read, and I picked up the second book like briefly, and I just didn't care. This book, the setup here is that we are following a main character whose name I've already forgotten, and she is in love with this boy and is kind of devastated when she finds out that he is going to marry her stepsister. And so she goes to one of the fates in this world, the fate of broken hearts, whose name is Jax. Sure. And and she makes a trade, makes a favor, or like begs a favor of Jax to stop the wedding. He stops the wedding, but in a very disastrous, a very intense way he stops the wedding. And our main character then does something that is perceived by everyone at large to be quite heroic. So she is kind of portrayed as this hero in the situation, even though she caused the problem to begin with. Parts of this felt very familiar to some other things that I have read, and not in like a on the nose kind of way. I don't know, like it didn't feel dramatically different in a positively significant way than any other YA I have read. So I just, not interested. I don't think it didn't really have that experience for me, and I'm not really interested in continuing. So there we have it. Those are all of the books that I read this month. Let me know what your favorite read for the month of April was. You will hear all about what I am reading in May, coming up soon, as well as my plans for June. June already! Oh my god. All right, I'll see you guys next time. Have a great day. Bye.